Money never sleeps, pal.
Hey there, I'm Pete Townsend, and this is Money Never Sleeps. We look inside the minds of entrepreneurs and at the crossover of startups, enterprise, finance, technology, and life as we know it. This episode of Money Never Sleeps is sponsored by Pat FinTech, the training partner that demystifies fintech and digital finance for financial services professionals. On the show this week, we've got Gerard Tannam.
Hello, I'm Gerard Tannam, a Strategic Brand Director at Island Bridge Brand Development.
Telling us all about the use of storytelling as a framework in bridging the gap between buyers and sellers, businesses, and their markets. In this episode, we weave through Gerard's own story that takes him from Ireland to Hong Kong and back again, then into the lessons learned from marketing and strategy direction for big brands before launching the Island Bridge business, and how building bridges between businesses and customers drives growth for businesses of all sizes. All right here on Money Never Sleeps. So listen, Gerard, it's awesome to be talking to an All-Ireland school soccer champion.
Oh, wow, you've been digging back into the story, yeah. In the business community in Ireland, soccer isn't particularly fashionable. Rugby is the sport of kings, and soccer is the sport of paupers. And you still hear guys dining out winning the Leinster Senior Rugby Schools Championship, because that's a big competition here in the public eye. But you rarely hear people referring to the All-Ireland Soccer Schools equivalent, because it's the poor relation. Probably a little similar to soccer and American football in high schools in America.
Who did you used to play for, Ger?
I played for a team called Drimna Castle. We were principally a Gaelic football school, but in my time there were a number of very good soccer players. I was 11th or 12th man, which means I was sometimes substitute and sometimes managed to get a game. But there were some very good guys ahead of me, notably a guy called Niall Quinn, who went on to play for Arsenal, Manchester City and Ireland, and a number of others too who excelled in soccer and other sports. So I was lucky to come through with a good vintage.
Did you play with a local team then as well?
I played all sorts of sports in school. I played soccer, Gaelic football, hurling and basketball, and I also sprinted and ran. Pretty much typical of Irish kids of that time. Now people are obliged to specialise much more early, but back then you trained once a week and played once a week, so you could play lots of sports.
I know myself, it also helped when you were on multiple teams in school. It meant you got out of school a lot.
Well, that's it. Exactly. Yeah, you got the knock on the door about 2:30 when everybody was settling into maths class to say, Gerard, the bus is leaving to play.
Or it's time to go put up the nets.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's great, and I love it that after all these years of living here and just finally making the connection as to why it's called soccer and not football here, because obviously football is GAA. Right, the Gaelic Athletic Association for our U.S. listeners, and that's Gaelic football. And that's
right. And of course, soccer comes from association football, which is what was used to distinguish it between rugby football and association football in England. So that's where soccer comes from.
There we go. That's all making sense now. Well, listen, it's awesome. Like I said, all you need to do to figure out these little things, Gerard, is just scroll to the bottom of the LinkedIn. That's it. Thank you. Yeah.
Owen, are we sponsored by LinkedIn yet, Pete?
No, I'm working on it. Anyway, listen, Gerard, fantastic to have you on the show tonight. Really appreciate you coming on. To get started, why don't you share your backstory, how you got to this point?
Well, I guess the backstory to Island Bridge kind of starts back in the late 80s and 90s. I lived and worked in Hong Kong. And I went to Hong Kong originally. I finished school here in Dublin, Ireland, and I went to UCD and did a BA in philosophy and then a master's in philosophy, which really didn't equip me at that time for a great deal of anything. It wasn't really recognized as useful to pretty much any career. And I spotted an ad in the Irish Times advertising for inspectors of police in Hong Kong. So I, with the innocence of a 22, 23-year-old, I thought I could do that. So I went out to Hong Kong, where I spent 10 years as a inspector of police. But whilst I was there, I was always involved with music and writing and various other things. So I got involved in the local folk music scene, got involved in various kind of music events, theatre events, etc. Found myself involved in event management. And the reason I start my backstory there is that when you travel to another country, whether you're working in another language, I learned Cantonese, or working in a new discipline, as I was as a police officer, you're having to translate everything that you've learned up to that point and ask yourself, how does this apply in a new reality? How does this apply in a new world? Because what worked in Ireland didn't necessarily work in Hong Kong, and vice versa. You're learning about new foods, about new languages, about new people, about new ways of looking at things. And of course, philosophy equips you really well to look at how the world is made through different points of view. And the early philosophers were scientists. So philosophers were really asking, what are the building blocks of the world? And in event management, you're also asking the same questions. You're asking, how am I going to translate this fantastic musician into an event or a ticket that somebody wants to buy? And as part of the event management, we also set up and ran an art gallery. All of this while I was still policing, but which makes a kind of crazy story. But the common thread that came through it all was that I became used to walking into an empty space and looking on both sides and asking the question, what do I need to do to fill the gap? How do I introduce a Chinese potter, for example, a ceramicist? How do I introduce a Chinese ceramicist to a Western audience who's never encountered, the history of Chinese pots and ceramics? So you're constantly being thrown into an environment where you're obliged to translate, to step into that space between, and to determine, how are we going to make this work? How's this world made up? What are the building blocks of this world? Because this world's different from the other world, And of course, narrative and story is concerned with making sense of the world, of finding a language to describe the world. So when Alice goes down the rabbit hole into Wonderland, what Lewis Carroll is doing is he's describing another world. And when we build brands, that's what we're doing. We're saying, in my world, this is how it works. In my world, this is how hospitality works. In my world, this is how mechanical engineering works. In my world, this is how financial services work, for example. Wow. So that was a great grounding for me, because everywhere I looked, I had people who were speaking a different language, eating different foods, coming from different family setups than I had come from, because I was a child of the 70s and 80s in Ireland, where we were very monocultural. We were very, very singular in how we saw things. We thought we saw things in the same way as everybody else. And of course, we discovered in the 80s and 90s that we had a point of view that was a little different than the English or the Scottish or the Welsh point of view, a little different from the American point of view, very different from the Chinese point of view. And so you have the fun of trying to make sense of all of those things as a young man, because as a young man, you're open to everything, to seeing, you're not too caught up in who's right or wrong. It's more about, hey, this is fun, there's a different point of view. And at that age, all of us spend our times just, drinking coffees or drinking beers long into the night, talking about how we see things and how other people see things,
Wow. Yeah, the penny just dropped for me, and I'm hearing the beginnings of a strategic brand director in the story that you're telling right now, translating stories, not just languages, but making these things accessible to a wider audience that makes something that they should get excited about unique.
Exactly.
And crafting that. So that was the business Art and Noise in Hong Kong.
That's right. Yeah. And we were involved in everything. I mean, in the sense that there literally were no boundaries for us, because, I didn't have any arts management training or anything like that. People would say to me, do you think we could do this? And I'd say, sure, why not? And of course, when you're an expat in another environment, you're also meeting other people from different parts of the world. And you're also meeting, Chinese who've studied in Vancouver and come back to Hong Kong. And people are just open. There's very little hierarchy. People couldn't care less which school I went to. Like when I was leaving Ireland back in 88, there was, typically people wanted to know which part of Dublin did you come from? Which school did you go to? And people put you in a box of sorts. And often it wasn't a bad box, but it was a box which said, this is what we expect of you. You meet somebody for the first time halfway around the world, nobody expects anything of you. Yeah, they expect you're Irish, so they expect you're going to enjoy a drink and a song and a bit of crack. But beyond that, people are very open to your saying, I could do that, or why not? Let's try that. So we got to try a lot of things that I know I wouldn't have been able to do back here in Ireland.
Very good. And then you did move back to Ireland, didn't you?
Yeah, and of course it all came crashing down because what I didn't realize is that over the 10 years, I was 10 years a police officer there, and it was probably the last 6 or 7 years of my time there that I really got into, I set up a company because we needed to have a company structure to partner with artists and musicians, etc. They needed something that they could relate with more formally than a guy who was going to put on a gig for them. And what I underestimated, I with great enthusiasm, I planned to bring the business back to Ireland. And it wasn't a foolish idea because we were doing work for some Irish companies. We were doing work for some Irish music acts. We were doing work with UCD, who were setting up a chair of Asian studies at the time. So we were doing some work which was reaching back into Ireland before I came back. And then we came back and I realized two things. The first thing was that I learned was that the Irish attitude to a contract or a proposal is very different to how the rest of the world views a proposal, and particularly the American view. And although Hong Kong has the legacy, a British colony, in its business, it's very American. It's much more American in how it does business. So in the American experience, in my experience, people say, hey, Gerard, what can you do for us? And I describe what I can do for you. And you say, Gerard, if you write that down on a bit of paper, we've got a deal. In other words, I need to see a proposal so I can sign off on it. Now, in Ireland, a proposal means, let me have a think about it. Let me put it in the drawer with all of the other proposals. Let me see, and I might get back to you. And Irish people, as you know, hate to say no. We hate to say no to people. So I came back to in Ireland where I was writing proposals. I wrote more proposals in my first year back in Ireland than I'd written in my 10 years in Hong Kong. And I discovered that too late, really, that the proposals were ending up in a drawer somewhere. And Irish people, we love the maybe. We love the arbitrary. And people don't want to say to you, I hate your idea. It's terrible. Like, we don't want to do it. Or we can't afford to do what you propose. So what we found was that the ideas which had worked really well, which flew in Hong Kong, crashed to earth in Dublin. That was the first thing. And the second thing was that I completely underestimated the importance of network, because over the years, I didn't realize that's what I was doing, but I built a network that wasn't just confined to Hong Kong. It was Asia-wide. I mean, I didn't have connections in every country in Asia, but the nature of Asia is that people travel around, including locals. They travel from country to country. So very soon you had a connection in Shanghai. You had a connection in the Philippines. You knew somebody in Malaysia who could introduce you to somebody else. And oddly enough, I came back into an Ireland where I had a really good social network, but I had nothing like a business network. And by the time I realized that, Arts and Noise had failed. And I had to painfully admit that the magic I had enjoyed in Hong Kong, it simply didn't work. It was like the Cinderella arriving back the day after and everything's turned into rags,
Yeah, no, Ireland in the year 2000 was a much different place than it is now.
Yeah.
But what has still lived on is I said to a guy yesterday who was trying to sell me solar panels for my house, and I'm like, after I listened to his proposition, I said, listen, I prefer the American fast no to the Irish slow maybe no.
Yes.
Right? And he's like, so do I. I said, I'll give you the American fast no, and here's why. Right? And whatever. But I'd say moving from Hong Kong to Ireland in the year 2022, pandemic behind us, would be a much different environment for you with Art and Noise. But this was, again, the year 2000. You jumped into some big brand directing businesses, didn't you?
Yeah, well, see, what happened was that, I suppose, as the business was failing, I got an opportunity. I was introduced to an extraordinary character who was chairman of the then National Safety Council. And they were about to devise a campaign in the year 1999, right, just on the eve of millennium. They wanted to devise a campaign which would reduce road deaths. And we were killing 450 people a year on our roads back in 1999. And I say killing because we talk about accidents, but nothing's an accident. If I get in behind the wheel of a car having drunk too much and drive too fast, that's not an accident. That's an event. So there were people being killed and dying. And of course, even beyond the deaths, there were, thousands of people suffering horrendous injuries on the roads. And the chairman pulled together a real ragtag of a team, which I was asked to lead, because they liked the fact that I had police experience and marketing experience. I mean, that was kind of funny in many respects because I had never seen it in that way. And oddly enough, suddenly there came a campaign which brought those two disciplines together. And with a small team of fantastic people who I've stayed in touch with to today, we devised a campaign called the Fly the Flag campaign, which by the end of 1999 was reducing road deaths by about 40%. And in the years intervening, many other very smart people, advertising agencies and others, have reduced the numbers from about 450 to 150 a year. And that was the first kind of glimpse I had that this wasn't kind of just playing around. When you live as an expat in another country, there's a little bit of never land about it. It feels like nothing really matters or nothing's real. In some respects, you send back dispatches to your mother and your father and you're telling about the wonderful things you're doing, but it doesn't feel real because it's happening over there. And I came back to Dublin and discovered that this thing that I now understand to be branding was something I had an instinct for, a gift for. And I was able to translate it into a campaign. And really at the heart of the campaign was the understanding that whether they liked it or not, there were two people forming a relationship on the road. The person who was about to die and the person who was about to kill him. And I say him because it was a 22-year-old, the center field player in the GA club, so the American quarterback equivalent in high school, okay? Getting into a car on a Saturday night outside the club or the pub, out of his head on drink, maybe some drugs, not so much at that time, getting into a car with a couple of mates, couple of girls, and driving as fast as he could towards his counterpart who was leaving another club in another part of the county. And I say county because much of this wasn't happening in Dublin. It was happening in rural areas because that's where you need to get into a car. And it was that discovery for me. Branding was all about that relationship between two people. And in this instance, I mean, it's quite a kind of a morbid relationship naturally, but we likened it to two knights getting onto the back of their horse and charging towards each other, understanding that death was likely to be the outcome. And we devised what we described as the Fly the Flag campaign. We invited motorists to fly a white flag, which was what a knight attached a white kerchief to his wrist when he wanted to say to anybody he met on the road, I'm not going to be a threat to you, because you attach the white flag to your sword hand, meaning I'm not going to take out my sword and strike you. I'm not going to take out my lance and attack you. So it was an absolute watershed for me. I'm not sure I'll ever do anything that will be as important in its impact as that campaign. And it opened up my eyes to understanding that branding is really concerned with the relationship between two people, usually a buyer and seller, but it's the relationship between two people who are about to meet. They don't know it yet, just like that Michael Bublé song says, I just haven't met you yet. So very often you don't know the person you're about to meet. But what a brand does is that it sets up the relationship. So when you do meet them, you're both clear about how you need to behave, about what's expected of you, and how the relationship works, what the roles involved are. And that really was the first formal step I took. Because when I went to work with a company called Alexander Dunlop, with a wonderful guy called Sandy Dunlop and his partner Bill Felton, Sandy said, you know what, you've been branding all these years. You just didn't know that's what you were doing. Exactly. And that's the truth of it. I had no idea really, because I didn't come from a marketing background. I came from, I suppose a people background, understanding how things work.
And do you think, Gerard, that, is that relationship piece, is that something that people at companies miss a lot?
Yeah, we talk about branding as something that somebody does to somebody else. So when you ask people about what a brand is, I often ask in workshops and at events, give me definitions of brand. And you hear, it's about reputation, it's about image, it's about promise. Branding is too often, in my view, talked about as something that somebody does to somebody else. I think branding and business, never mind branding, business is all about relationships. People say that, but then they quickly behave as though it's not a relationship. They behave as though it's a one-way street. And it's not a one-way street. It's a bridge. It's a two-way conversation. It's a two-way exchange. And if it isn't working for both parties, then it isn't working.
Yeah, I hear you. And I really like that point about Michael Bublé, but I think Michael Bublé stole that from WB8. There are no strangers here, only friends who haven't met
Well,
yet.
there you go. Yeah, exactly. There is that. I mean, there's a sense in that we're people. We're it doesn't matter if I haven't met you before. The fact of the matter is, I'm a social animal. You're a social animal. So let's assume that there's certain behavior, certain treatment, certain things that we can expect of one another that tell us a little bit about what it means to do business, for example. And obviously, most of what I do is concerned with doing business. Not everything, but most of the brand work we do is concerned with commercial enterprises rather than not-for-profits or community enterprises.
Perfect. Well, why don't you tell us about what Island Bridge is today, and maybe also share with us how the lean years were at the very beginning.
Well, I was taken on by Sandy Dunlop and Alexander Dunlop, and we had a few wonderful years, which culminated very, very tragically with 9/11. I was tasked with opening up the American market for our business. And so I spent a lot of time in the late 99, 2000, 2001, I spent a good deal of time in New York and Boston and up in Wisconsin as well, working with brands like Miller Lite and Capital One Financial Services and others. And so I got a great grounding in strategic planning and brand development. And then I was very fortunate in that I was invited by one of our clients here in Ireland to work with him exclusively in developing a new business he was engaged with. So he wanted to hire me as his strategic planner, really. And there wasn't enough work for a single strategic planner in his business. So I said to him, great, I'll come across and work on your business on the condition I get an opportunity to set up my own business, and I'll also service other clients, but you'll be my priority. So we came to a really good arrangement, which meant that the early years for Island Bridge, I didn't have any of those kind of startup pains or headaches because I had a backer or a patron in some respects, somebody who was funding a certain amount of work from the get-go. The lean years kind of hit, and they hit everybody around the same time, is that at that time we were doing a lot of work in hospitality. We had a lot of hotel group clients and individual hotel clients, tourism clients. And the downturn of the crash of 2007, 2008, hospitality got wind of that first. I'm not sure why, but hoteliers knew that things were going to come to a crash and to an end almost before anybody else. So what we found was that about a year before Lehman Brothers and the other events that precipitated the crash, we started to notice that there was less appetite for our expertise. And because we were very strong in that service space, because hospitality is probably the greatest embodiment of branding, because you have very clearly two people who are in a very well-defined relationship, and hospitality is all about service. And so we were in a very, very strong position, but I realized that we were starting to lose new opportunities. The phone wasn't ringing quite as often. So we had to go looking for where the opportunities were. And what we found was that much of that was in manufacturing, production, distribution, logistics, etc. Because very often the producer is at one end of a very, very long supply chain. And in those environments, the producer rarely gets to meet the end customer, the person actually eating the meat or, using the camera or whatever it might be that's being produced. So what we realized was that to some extent, hoteliers, much more immediately than others, and to some extent, great hoteliers didn't really need a strategic brand planner to come in and tell them what they were already doing very, very well. Where we were needed was in environments where there wasn't such an obvious connect with the customer. And typically those were in businesses which were legacy businesses where the founder 40 years ago had a very strong connection with the customer. And then as the business grew, the distance grew between the person running the company and the people that they were serving, and their own teams often as well. So what you had now was maybe 6 or 7 departments, all with a different picture of what the customer relationship looked like. And so that's where we found the opportunities. We wouldn't have found them unless we were pushed to it, because we were very comfortable in the hospitality space.
That's a really interesting piece that you touched on, Ger. How do you work with companies then, I suppose, or what's your way of working with companies that have become distanced from, the end customer? Or like you said, where maybe different parts of the organization have a different view of the relationship with the customer?
Yeah, well, it's funny. On about 5 or 6 years ago, I named the business Island Bridge in 2004. First of all, because it's a reasonably good description of what it is we do. We bridge the gap between two people who are separated from one another. But I also named it for family reasons. My father grew up just up the road from Island Bridge in Dublin, and it was his playground in the 20s and 30s. Island Bridge, he learned to swim in the river, the Liffey River at Island Bridge. So much of my naming of the business was instinctive. But about 6 or 7 years ago, one of our clients, who's a mechanical engineer, said to me, Gerard, every time you describe brand to me, he said, you're using the language of bridge. And he said, that makes perfect sense to me, partly because I'm a mechanical engineer, and also partly because bridging a gap between two people makes absolute perfect sense when you want to talk about communication or marketing or messaging or imaging or any of those things. So we formally adopted that language a number of years ago. So we see brand as standing for a bridge between two people. And a bridge is another name for a relationship. If you shake hands with somebody, you're forming a bridge. If you meet somebody's eyes across a room, you're forming a bridge. If you smile at somebody, you're forming a bridge. So you can form a bridge with people even through a virtual setup like we're on at the moment. So there's many ways to build bridges. So what does a real bridge builder do? And of course, a real bridge builder does three things typically. First of all, they do a survey. They say what's on this side of the gap, what's on the other side of the gap, and what other bridges are available to two people if they want to cross over and transact. We look at those three things in the survey. We look at our clients and what they value in the business. We look at their customers and what they value in the transaction. And then we look at what the marketplace seems to value. And it's in the value that you get an understanding of what it is that people want to exchange, because people are always exchanging around their perception or understanding of what's valuable to them or what's important to them. And then we define a framework that describes that relationship, that says, in this particular business, in this operation, this is the role that you're playing, and this is the role your customer is playing, because we all play different roles at different times of our lives. We tend to think of ourselves just having a single role, but of course we know very quickly we don't. We're dads, we're sons, we're brothers, we're friends, we're suppliers, we're buyers, so it's really important to understand not only what role you play in your business, but also what role your customer is playing in their lives at that time. And we define that relationship through the two roles. And then we put together an action plan to build a bridge. And then, like any real bridge builder, then we go out into the real world and we pull in the engineers and the civil surveyors and the geologists and stuff, and we say, let's build that bridge. And we put that infrastructure in place. And that's really at the core of what we do, is that we define that relationship. Just as I was doing 30 years ago, standing in an empty gallery space in Hong Kong, looking at a wall and asking, what do I need to do to bring people in to look at this artist's paintings or sculptures or photography or whatever it might be? What do I need to do to bridge that gap? So that's what we do. And then for many of our clients, we work on an ongoing basis to help them to support and maintain their infrastructure, to ensure that their brand continues to be fit for purpose. And it's really important when we think about brand in those terms. You're probably both familiar with the Samuel Beckett Bridge down at the convention center. It's a beautiful bridge. It was built by or designed by Calatrava, the Spanish architect, who's a genius. He designed another bridge further up the river at the James Joyce Bridge. But the Samuel Beckett Bridge is a beautiful bridge, but it's a useless bridge, because most of the time the traffic on the bridge is stopped. And bridges are not designed to support static traffic. Bridges are designed to ensure that people pass quickly, easily, and safely from one side to the other. And that's what brands are for. Brands are not about being beautiful. It doesn't mean you can't be useful and beautiful at the same time. But the most important thing when you define a brand is you ask, is this relationship useful? And I don't mean useful in a utilitarian sense. I mean, is it productive, fruitful? Is there a real exchange happening because we have put this brand infrastructure in place.
Really interesting. Really interesting. Because for the longest time, right, when people were talking about branding, and this was, 5-6 years ago, at the beginning of my journey into working with startups, Jer, that when you talk about branding, you automatically think logo.
Yes.
Right. But logo is just not even an end result. It's just it's a symbol. It's something. Right.
Exactly.
And that, the brand to me as a customer is how does that business make me feel?
Yes.
Right. And the brand to the brand owner, the business is what is the feeling that I want to evoke?
Yes.
Right. And what is it that I want to project to hopefully do that? So I could see how the two of them could totally miss each other.
Yes.
Right. And so I'm totally getting this now, which is giving me a real buzz. This episode of Money Never Sleeps is sponsored by Pat FinTech, demystifying fintech and digital finance for financial services professionals. Pat FinTech enable financial services professionals to transform their capabilities into the digital age with dedicated virtual training programs geared towards those that can develop, deliver, and monitor optimally customized user experiences balanced by appropriate governance, control, and oversight. To learn more about Pat FinTech, go to moneyneversleeps.ie/PAT FinTech. Listen, when you had to digitally transform yourself, really, out of the last year and a half, how have you adjusted to operate more in the digital world?
Well, the biggest challenge to us as we were coming out of that first lockdown, everybody was just saying, we're just going to sit tight, kind of get on as best we can. And a lot of our business came to a halt. The biggest challenge for us was that our survey work involves our going and site visiting our clients, customers. So our clients, first of all, so spending time with them in their business, and then spending time with their customers. So 2 or 3 years ago, I was visiting farmers in Belgium. I was visiting builders merchants in Hamburg. I was meeting with hoteliers in Scotland as part of our survey work. So of course, pandemic hits and we can't visit. And I always believe is that people will tell you something when you're face to face with them that they'll never tell you over the phone. And they certainly won't tell you in an email, and they absolutely will never tell you in SurveyMonkey, right? So we were immediately in a real quandary there. So the biggest transformation we had to make was around making this medium work, making the telephone work, making the video conference work, and making sure that when we interacted with our customers and when we interacted with their customers, that we were doing everything we could to kind of bring us into the same space as best we could. So for example, very simple thing is that before I come on a call, I switch off everything except the medium. I made sure that every time I was interacting with somebody, it's precious time, so I wasn't going to be distracted. So that was the first thing. And then I also, before we surveyed or interacted with people, I would also spend more time trying to anticipate where they were likely to be and what their situation was likely to be. And for example, if I detected that somebody was very distracted, I would often suggest that we reschedule, take the pressure off them, because it was apparent that they weren't in any condition to chat. And for our work to work, we have to have that relationship ourselves with our. Often when we finish our survey work, our clients will tell us they feel we have a closer relationship with their customer than they do. When we go and interview somebody on behalf of our customer, their customers see us as somehow representing, and they tell us things that they wouldn't even tell our client. So that was the biggest challenge for us, was, if you like, making digital as real as possible, because that's the big difficulty with digital. It doesn't feel real. It's so easy to buy something online because it doesn't feel real. You know what I mean? You're just pressing a button, you know?
I know. And it's really interesting how you say that, getting that element of trust with your clients' customers. There's something about pheromones that exist in the human condition somehow that have an effect on how we all perceive and build relationships, build bridges with each other. And without that, was there a point where you got that feeling that you were able to make that work over Zoom?
Yeah, it hasn't worked perfectly. But for example, we're working with a travel company at the moment, a global travel company. And one of the things that my colleague Anne suggested, which was just such a super idea, when we were talking to this travel company's guests, and speaking about their trips and travels, we asked them to share some of their favorite photographs from their trip with our client before the call. So they sent us 2 or 3 snaps, just that for them embodied, and we started the conversation by sharing the image on screen. And what that allowed us both to do was to step into the space together and to reminisce and laugh and whatever. There's lots of things you can do if you take the time to do it, to connect, but you have to take the time, and you have to recognize the limitations of the medium, and the media we use are limited. So some of them help us to do extraordinary things, but they're limited, and most often what they limit is exactly that connection you talk about, the pheromones, the sense of somebody that's very difficult to communicate effectively. Sometimes I ask people to turn off the video because video is very distracting. And I did some work a number of years ago on radio. And one of the things I learned about radio is that the power of the voice without pictures is extraordinary. We're much more likely to trust a radio presenter than we are a TV presenter. Because when we see him on TV, he's too distracting. There's too many things, mixed messages. Whereas if the only thing you hear from somebody is their voice, and you like their voice, and you like what they have to say to you, well, then you're going to buy into it. You build that trust.
And that's the power of the podcast these days. My wife was saying the other day to me, she's like, you know, she's entering a new industry now. My wife is getting herself into crypto, which is interesting. Right. And she said, I can do 3 things at once. I need to go to Dunn's, I need to go for a walk, and I need to learn something. So I can stick my headphones in, listen to Peter McCormick, What Bitcoin Did, and figure out crypto and learn that. And you can take that voice with you, and you can't do that with a visual. No. Right. And we get a lot of people ask, hey, you know, can you turn Money Never Sleeps into a video podcast? I said, we could. It's a lot of time and effort to get the video right. And I'm sure Conan Brophy, our producer, could help us with that. But it's like, you know, let's just stick with the audio, you know?
Yes.
But listen, I know kind of coming out of what are we coming out of now? The 3rd lockdown. A lot of businesses in Ireland obviously have been decimated.
Yes.
Right. Some have shut up shop completely. Some will never come back. Some are coming back now, which is great. The hospitality sector, that obviously is going through some significant challenges. What are the types of things that you are thinking about or sharing with your customers or sharing with new customers on reestablishing this bridge with their customers?
Well, look, I suppose the first thing to say is that I think very often in times of great change, there are casualties which are simply casualties of things are going to be done differently now, and the way that you used to do them no longer applies. So their customers don't want that service or that product in the same way as they did before. And sometimes the bravest thing is to say that business as I knew it doesn't exist anymore. I may need to do as your wife is doing. I may need to move into something else. So I think sometimes we can be, understandably, we get emotionally attached to our businesses. And I was very emotionally attached to Arts and Noise all of those years ago. It was heartbreaking to acknowledge that something that had worked really well for me and my family. I mean, we lived a great life in Hong Kong as a result of that business. And suddenly it wasn't working. And of course, the first thing you do is that you take it on yourself and you say, there's something wrong with me, or, you know, it's no good anymore, or maybe it was never any good. But it was. So that's part of it. So sometimes there are businesses, and I don't mean to be heartless, but sometimes there are businesses which are no longer in business. The world has moved on. So that's part of it. The second thing I think is that, you know, when the world changes, of course, for most businesses, there are opportunities and there are things they can do. But what I always advise people to come back to is to ask the question, what role am I playing in people's lives? What role was I playing before the pandemic in this instance? And is that role continued to be appropriate? You ask yourself, how does my relationship with my customer, which has to be at the core of every business, how does that now relate in the new world? What are the things that are important in the new world, and are the new way of doing things, the new concerns, the new worries? You know, it's understanding that there's a considerable portion of the population, even when vaccinated, are going to be nervous about close proximity. So it's about understanding that handshakes are now something that you need to approach a little bit more sensitively. In a year, 2 years, 3 years time, I think we'll still be asking ourselves the question, is it okay to shake hands? And checking with the other person. Are you comfortable with shaking hands? Because some people won't be. That's the reality,
Yeah, you did right.
Good.
Yeah.
Were there some early lessons learned from, way back at the beginning that have carried through to today that you think are important to how you're running the business and how you're engaging with customers?
Yeah, when we look back, we did some great work, we did some mediocre work, and we did some indifferent work. And of course, when you do work like that, you sometimes ask yourself, whose fault is it? And it's very easy to point the finger at the customer. But it's almost never the customer's fault. It's almost always yours. You're leading the dance. In this case, we're the brand guys. They're not the brand guys. They've probably never branded before. So it's my responsibility to set things up in such a way that we can't fail. And not they can't fail or I can't fail. We can't fail. So it taught me to put a huge amount of work into setting up the relationship, minding the relationship, letting them know what to expect. So as a quick example of that, every time we win a new piece of business, the very first thing I do is send the customer a thank you card. Before we send an invoice, before we send a contract to be signed, I send them a thank you card. Because what I want them to know is that we really appreciate the business. And then throughout the process, every Monday morning, every one of our clients in an active project gets a note from me saying, here's where we are on your project. Sometimes it's to say, there's nothing for you to worry about. We're in survey mode or we're in framework mode or whatever it might be. But just so you know, we're here, we're doing what we committed to do, and you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to check, you don't have to come to me. And then the other part of that is that if we're going to be delayed in something or if we can't deliver, we tell our customer as quickly as we can. And that's something I picked up from an extraordinary guy I'm sure you're both familiar with, Seth Godin, who talks about all the time, talks about if you can't deliver when you say you will, the sooner you tell your customer, the better. Because there's no advantage to them in knowing late. So those are the three things that we learned kind of from relatively early on, was that, you really got to appreciate the business, because every piece of business is what, it's what puts the bread on the table. But our policy is, that as soon as somebody reaches out to us, we get back in touch with them, because that's what you do with people that you care about.
I gotcha. That's really helpful. And I'm gonna think deeply about a couple of those things as well, because that's incredibly useful. We're down to our last two questions, Jer.
Yeah.
And the second to last one is a new one that I got out of this list of 60 questions that will really make people think. So you're the guinea pig for this one, Jer.
Okay.
And I may not ever use it again, depending upon how you answer it.
No pressure.
But what is the one thing that you've found to be true in maintaining your business success that others commonly believe to be false?
I think in the era of digital social media, because of course we've had social media back to the days of the cavemen. I mean, all media is social by its nature. But if we think of digital in particular, there is a huge pressure on businesses to be constantly publishing in one form or shape. And of course, we have to remember that the various digital platforms are all glorified advertising agencies. I mean, they appear as something else, but ultimately they want to sell us something. Our participation means that they now have eyeballs or ears or whatever it might be, looking at them, listening to them, etc. And there's a real misconception. I mean, it's probably one of the first things I do when we go in to clients and say, stop doing all the things you're doing. You're trying to be a publisher in dozens of areas. And the reality is that there's a very, very small number of people and a very particular type of person who's a good publisher. The rest of us are not good publishers. So stop publishing. Stop feeling you have to keep filling the silence. Sometimes shut up and listen. Stop talking, stop chattering. I did a little bit of professional speaking training many years ago, and one of the guys who was involved in the training used to say, "Who are we to break the silence?" Sounds very profound, very zen, right? Who are we to break the silence? But he's absolutely right? the world is full of noise. So we got to be very careful about breaking the silence. So people, many of the businesses that I meet with first, they're obsessed with, we're not tweeting enough, we're not producing video enough, we're not podcasting enough, and I say, well, there's only a certain number of people should be publishing, and the rest of us should be listening. That's
to quote Fontaine's DC in A Hero's Death.
Yeah.
When you speak sincere.
Yeah.
And believe me, friend, everyone will hear.
Yeah, there you go. It's part of the same, but it's also sometimes, and of course we Irish are terribly talkative. So, and I'm no exception. So sometimes it's about just saying, just stop. Don't feel you have to be filling don't be cheerleading. You read posts and like every second person, here, cheers, well done. And you say to yourself, well, yeah, the sentiments are great, but really, what are you adding to, the business owner who's reading it, or what are you contributing?
I know. And they're beyond even the publishing. There's the obsession with the likes and the retweets. Yeah. Right? And the sharing.
Yes.
And interestingly, I had an experience with a client recently where I follow their stuff. I see it on Twitter. It rarely gets a like. But you know what? One of those posts that they put out that nobody liked led to 3 phone calls to the founder that wanted to do something with them.
Yes.
Right? You don't see any of that on Twitter.
No.
All you see is results on the bottom line of a business.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's untraceable. So, yeah, sometimes you do got to let go of some of this stuff. Yeah. It's a word from the wise.
Yeah, there's a time and a place. To be clear, I'm not anti social media. It's just that we need to decide on our terms. It's
absolutely.
We've got to decide what works for us and also what works for our customers and our colleagues and partners, and not simply be speaking for the sake of.
I hear you. Owen, over to you, pal. Last question.
Yep, and you kind of probably stole our thunder by telling us that story about being a Hong Kong policeman at the very start. But
it's on his LinkedIn profile.
Well, there's an even earlier one. There's an earlier one. I had my 2 of my 3 kids over for dinner earlier this evening. I was saying to them, I might need a bit of a help with this last question. And I said, the guys are bound to know I was a police officer. What should they know about me that's unexpected? Well, I suppose
well, in that case, then tell us something we wouldn't expect to know about.
Well, I spent 2 years in a Catholic seminary studying to be a priest from age 18 to 20.
Holy moly.
Well, there you go. Holy moly is right. So, and of course, in many respects, it's unexpected. But of course, when you think about it, it all adds up. When you retrofit, when you get to my age, I'm in my mid-50s, and you look back on not just your life, but your career. And of course, it's very, very easy to write the narrative looking back, because it seems inevitable that I ended up here today talking to you 2 guys talking in this way. And in some respects, it was inevitable because, my initial attraction towards working as a priest was that notion of connecting, making sense of, getting to grips with the building blocks of the world. How do things work? How do people work? How do we relate? All of those things. So, in many respects, it's surprising. Not so much surprising to somebody of my vintage because, at that time, it wasn't unusual for a young man or a young woman to head off to a seminary or a monastery or something similar, a convent. And to
Well, what I was going to say, Gerard, is now you're speaking like a philosopher.
Yes.
So thank you.
There you go.
Well, listen, it's been awesome having you on the show tonight, Gerard.
Yeah.
I learned something out of this, so thank you. You've got a wonderful story, and a story that needed to be told, and you've got plenty of stories that I'm sure will continue to be told. So looking forward to staying in touch with you and hearing more.
Absolutely. Thanks to you both, and thanks to Claire Mason, of course, for putting us both in touch. It's nice to meet you guys, and this is, as you say, looking forward to listening to you, because of course you'll have many guests, and hopefully my guinea pig question hasn't disqualified you from.
Oh no,
we'll keep that one.
we'll keep that one alive. So thank you, Gerard.
Good stuff.
Thanks.
That does it for this week, folks. Thanks to Gerard for opening up his mind to help us figure out why he does what he does. Links to get in touch with Gerard and learn more about the Island Bridge business are on our website at moneyneversleeps.ie, so check us out online and subscribe to our Money Never Sleeps newsletter as well. Also, thanks to Conan Brophy from Create Sound for mixing and editing this episode. Conan is an excellent media man to get in touch with when you're thinking about launching your own podcast. As for me, I'm the founding partner at Norio Ventures, and I'm an early-stage startup advisor and investor helping fintech and digital asset startups get their product to market, build traction with customers, and raise funding. If you'd like to talk to me about your business, get in touch at pete@norioventures.com. Finally, till next time, thanks for listening. See ya!
Money never sleeps, pal.